whisper soft and true, darling, I love you.
George was the youngest one of the group, and he was the kind of kid who followed the others around, even at school. And I guess that with talents like John and Paul, who are probably the greatest songwriters of the 20th century as far as we're concerned, it's tough opposition. And they collaborated and kind of also rivaled each other in their writing. George didn't have anybody. George had to do it by himself. And so he worked away at it, and he had tremendous determination and application. He would craft his music meticulously with every little stitch in the canvas, and gradually built up his songwriting technique to a point where he became a great writer. He wasn't to begin with, but then he started writing great songs, and I've said something I think is one of the greatest love songs ever written. It's a wonderful song.
It was the Institute really where he started to get sort of musical, and that was probably about, from my memory of him, I mean obviously he did it at a younger age, but my memory of him was around about sort of 14, 15 years old. He was really starting sort of to get interested in stuff.
It really was John and Paul's band, and it was that magic chemistry. What George did after a couple of years of the roller coaster, he added something with his guitar solos that neither John or Paul could, well, they didn't think about them. He just added.
There were lots of groups springing up, mainly at sort of local dance halls, and then later it progressed into clubs opening. And they used to play, the end of term, they used to bring guitars into school. They got met at the school office by the vice principal, who then stashed them away. And about the last hour of term we were allowed to bring them out, and they used to do jam sessions in one of the classrooms, which was really good stuff, because you had all this, the things, the stars we weren't seeing that were coming over from the States. They were singing all their songs, and that got to be really good stuff. Later on, just after he'd left, we were, as I say, a city school, and so the Cavern had opened up by about sort of 62, I think it was, 61, 62. And whilst McCartney was still just pushing school, George had left. But the Beatles were then sort of formed, and they used to perform lunchtimes and sort of evenings down at the Cavern amongst other clubs. The sixth form was supposed to be having their free periods in the library. And what happened with this particular day was the sixth form was about nearly 200 strong at the Institute. They checked up and found that there was something like about 50 lads in the school, in the library where they should be. They did a raid on the Cavern, and something like 100 plus sort of sixth formers were led back by a posse of masters through the town back to the school. And as George wasn't keen on the discipline angle, though he'd left, he'd quite liked that one, for the fact that people had come down to listen to his music when both he and Paul had been told they'd never make any money out of sort of playing a guitar.
Well, I think George realised what he was up against with both John and Paul, and also me to a certain extent, because I must confess that I would obviously concentrate on the guys who were giving me the hits. And in the beginning, George's work was kind of tolerated. Oh yes, we must have a George song in this thing. It's kind of saying, well, it's not going to be as good as the others, but we'll let him have it on, which was terribly unfair, I know that, and I do regret that. But you can't blame me, because I had to deal with two marvellous people as well as him.
You've got to admit that McCartney and sort of John Lennon were brilliant songwriters. McCartney also, once he started playing bass guitar, became one of the best bass guitarists that we had in this sort of country. He really learnt his trade. They seem to be the up-front characters, but I think George Harrison kept them together. He was the quiet one, but the calm one when they went over to the States and people started the adulation over there. He often sort of, with a quiet bit of sense of humour on one of the interviews and things that they did, just kept things down and in balance. And I think he was a balancing member.
And of course his contribution to the group as a whole was immense, because his guitar playing was superb, and his interest in other cultural music, Indian in particular, gave the Beatles a good twist. I mean, we talk about Indian music, but in fact, the first time we used a sitar on a Beatle record was on a John Lennon song, which had nothing to do with Indians at all, and that was Norwegian Wood. And the use of a sitar on that song gave it a wonderful twist. It was a kind of a jokey thing, but a very, the song itself is a very wry song, and it lended tremendous atmosphere to that song. And all of George's influences on the Beatles were very benign and tremendous.
I first saw George Harrison, I think must have been autumn of 1962. I'd been called by Brian Epstein to organise publicity for this band called the Beatles, and they had a record coming out on Parlophone called Love Me Do. The four of them arrived. Ringo didn't say a word. George said hello. Paul McCartney did most of the talking until the very last interview, and John took over and nearly separated the guy's body from his head. And as I put them in a cab to go to the station so they get the train back to Liverpool, George said, "Thank you very much." That was really the first time.
What does it feel like to be 21?
The same.
Come.
I don't really fancy 21. I much rather like 20, you know, it's sort of nice round figure and all that. Happy birthday to you, 23 today.
Thank you very much. Tell me, what presents have you got?
George, will you come in? Go back a bit. Craig, can you come out of the
All right, George.
Yeah. Let's go. George, pop one in your mouth. Come on, everybody back then.
4-foot-high cake and 52 bags of stuff to be looked through. So I can't say at the moment. I'd like to say thanks a lot anyway, you know, because, you know, thousands of people have sent me things. Thank you, everybody. Very nice.
My first impression of George was that he was very shy. But when I saw John's outbreak towards this journalist who told him that beat groups, guitar-led beat groups, British groups would never happen, I realised that he may well have been intimidated by both Paul, who'd been Mr. Smooth with all the rap, all the repartee all day, and John, who, once he lost or appeared to lose his temper, was absolutely brilliant with his oratory.
Some fans?
Bottle or two, a couple of bottles, packets of ciggies.
How about a special message for fans, George?
Yeah, a very, very happy Christmas, and send me jacket back, it's cold.
John?
Gary Crimble and Manny Rudolph.
Ringo?
Merry Christmas, Happy New Year, see you soon.
Paul?
Lots of luck and many presents and happy Crimble. That's all I think.
George used to like quite a large quiff. You could get away with it in school, plaster it down a bit and then sort of change it out, you know, when you went out at night. He was, I don't think any different from the rest of us. We were all trying out different hairstyles and things at that sort of stage of the game. I mean, Presley was on the scene. You'd have Bill Haley before that, but you had Presley, then you had sort of Jerry Lee Lewis and the Golden Locks and whatever. And everybody who happened to like a particular singer used to try and copy that person's it doesn't sound very good, that, but it used to try and copy that person's sort of attributes, yeah.
The question of George's contribution to the Beatles and what would they have been with him or without him probably really is a two-part question. Initially, he was really the third member of the band. Once they hit that roller coaster ride of success and he started to play some of those great solos, he was then accepted, I think, musically by Paul and by John as being a very, very integral part of the group.
Their admirers spanned the generation gap, and in 1965 they were all awarded the MBE.
Tell me how you feel. Tell me love is real. Words of love you whisper soft and true. Darling, I love you.
Well, gentlemen, first of all, many congratulations on your MBE. The whole country seems very delighted indeed, but how do you feel about it, Paul?
Delighted indeed. You know, I'm glad everyone's delighted.
I love it.
But I mean, is it fun for you? Or?
Yeah, of course. I mean, you know, it'd be fun for you, wouldn't it? You know, if you just woke up one morning and he said, you know, it's great.
Ringo, how did you first hear about it?
Well, we heard about it 6 weeks ago when we got the forms to fill in, and then we knew that we were going to get it 2 days ago, officially.
How did these forms come? What, straight through the post or in the fan mail or what?
I don't, just in brown envelopes. They were delivered by somebody, you know, by hand. I think one of Brian's secretaries.
I'll tell you.
All right,
I'll
well,
tell
how did it happen then, George?
They were sent from the Prime Minister at Downing Street to our manager's office, and they were delivered from there to Twickenham, where we were filming. And then about the day later, we just found them, and we thought we were being called up for the army. And then we opened them, and we found out we weren't. We weren't.
all said that line.
I know, but this is at ITV. The other, that was the other one.
I see.
Why is the MBE awarded, though?
I don't know.
No idea.
In fact, you know, I know nothing about it. It's just that we've got it, and it's nice to have, and it doesn't make you more respectable or anything, I don't think. Maybe other people think it does. Doesn't make me any more respectable. I'm still a scruff.
Well, I was wondering about that. Ringo, how do you feel about going to the palace in a morning suit and all that?
I don't mind, you know. It's all right, when I buy one.
You haven't got one?
No, not yet. I've got an evening suit, if that'll do.
I don't think it will.
Different from a morning suit.
Well, I'll just go in my pyjamas then.
He was always very available to people. I bumped into him in town just after he'd come back from from Hamburg the first time. And George always stopped and talked to you. And he was generally interested in what people had to say. You'd have a good old natter. And this particular time he said to me, he said, look, you know, the first all-nighter's on at a club called the Iron Door. And he said that was along with people like Jerry and the Pacemakers, Rory Storm and the Hurricanes, and sort of a whole variety of Liverpool groups at the time. And got a couple of tickets for that, went along to it, had to queue to get in the flipping thing, even though you had tickets. And it was a pretty seedy place, backstreet place, just off Dale Street. I think that's where Cilla Black started as a hat check girl. And they were half an hour late coming in. They then sort of tuned up for 3/4 of an hour, and the place was sort of, you know, getting a bit sort of restless by then. But when they went into this, they left everybody else absolutely standing. It was pure magic. Well, afterwards I went up to see them. They went in the upper tier room and they're having a beer, and I went up to see George just to say, you know, great show. And he came across, he got up from me, came across and was having a natter. And then up comes John Lennon. I'd never met John Lennon in my life, and he comes across and sort of says, hey, how are you, man? You know, how are you doing? Sort of, no, great to see you again. And started to push George out the way. And he wasn't taking any of that. They always say he was subservient. Not at all. He sort of said, he just looked at him and he said, don't be so bloody stupid, John. He said, you don't know him. He said, now piss off. And we can always rephrase that if you like, but he basically was not going to be put aside by him at all. But I found that he stood up to them very well. People get this idea that you know, he was in their shadow, but I don't think he was in the slightest. He just was a quiet guy, and when he had something to say, he said it very forcibly.
Well, I find myself in distinguished company.
The second time.
And may I, without more ado, introduce George Harrison,
Hello.
MBE.
Oh, thank you.
John Lennon, MBE.
Oh, sorry, yeah.
Ringo Starr, MBE. And Paul McCartney, MBE. Now, a general question to all you gentlemen, and I must call you gentlemen now. How do you feel, John, about having the MBE?
I feel great, you know, we're honoured. We are, though.
Were you terribly surprised?
Yeah, you know, I mean, everybody was, I think. Well, I think we were the most surprised. Us and Donald Zack.
George,
yeah?
What was your first reaction when you heard you'd been awarded the MBE?
Well, I didn't believe it really at first, but then when they sent me all bits of paper saying that, and you wrote it in the papers, well, you had to believe it. It's great, you know. Didn't expect it at all, you know.
Ringo hasn't told his mum yet.
Is this true, Ringo? You haven't told your mum about this yet?
No, she'll have read about it today, though.
Were you surprised at all?
Yes, very.
When did you first know you had been awarded the MBE?
2 days ago. We had the form 6 weeks ago to fill in, you know, but we didn't know we'd actually got it till 2 days ago.
Did the form come with the rest of your fan mail, or did it come separately? In a very sort of impressive envelope?
Yes, we all thought it was caller papers. I keep using that line, it's not mine. And, but when we opened them, it was, you know, if you'd like to have an MBE, sign here. So we did. Yes, so we signed our name, Richard Starkey, you know, MBE, not Ringo.
Thank you very much.
Still the same Ringo.
Sent 2 bottle tops and we got it.
Paul, how do you react to having this award?
I think it's great, marvellous. You know, it is, isn't it? Well, you can't say anything about it. It's just
Do you think
great.
you really deserve an award like the MBE?
I don't know, you know. What does it matter? We got it, you know. Doesn't it?
You got a medal of the actual MBE. Where will you wear it?
I hope it's on a bit of a tag so you can shove it around your neck, you know, because if it's got a pin, you wreck all your suits. You know, I want a bit of a tab on mine.
Thank you.
It's all right.
Well, if you're asking about George's girlfriends, I'm afraid that the only one I have direct knowledge of was a sort of very dark, raven-haired, gorgeous little Welsh lass called Valmire Roberts, who was all of 5 years old. And we used to vie to sit next to her in class, and she was with us at Dovedale till about sort of 7 years old. Both George, myself, and the guy called Paul Hogarth fancied her like mad, and we used to sort of manipulate it to try and... They used to have a merit system in the class, and they used to move you around according to how many stars you'd got that week for the work you'd done. Well, it got to be that people were manipulating whether they worked hard or didn't work hard as to how close they could get to Valmire Roberts. And George was very much amongst on that little lot. I think over the 3 years we were in the sort of, you know, the infants together, we all went out with her at some stage or another, but I think that was probably engineered by her. I often wonder what happened to Valmire Roberts, but thereafter, girlfriends, I really didn't come across any of George's girlfriends.
I got involved with a dress designer called Ozzie Clark, who in the 60s we worked with and was our hero and what have you, and he went through the drug period like so many of the musicians. And I tried to help him get back on his feet. And one day in came Pattie Boyd, who was George's wife. I mean, we all fell in love with Pattie Boyd. She was just incredible. Ozzie fortunately was gay, and Pattie knew that. And Ozzie did this incredible routine. He just ran his hands right over her body, right the way down, said, "Do you like this fabric?" And he just sat down, cut the cloth, stitched it all up, put it back on, and made this absolutely perfect cut on the bias dress for her. It made her look even better, and I've got to tell you, she looked fantastic. We all love Pattie Boyd. She was in and out of our lives very early on. And when she married George, it was the quote, the fairy tale glamour wedding. It was a glam wedding compared with Paul, compared with John's weddings. It was the glam London wedding of that year.
Pattie, do you think you can ever live the life of a normal housewife now?
Yes, of course. Don't see why not.
Are you going to stay out of the limelight?
Yes.
Out of your own choice?
Yes.
And what about the family? How many children do you want to have?
About 3.
39. Give or take. Can I have the story of your romance? Pattie, how did it all start?
Well, we met on the set of A Hard Day's Night when George and the others were filming it, and I was chosen to play a part of a schoolgirl by Dick Lester and Walter Shenton.
Good old Dick Lester and Walter Shenton.
Yes.
Well, I've not been for Ram. And take it up from there. What happened then?
Well, actually, I asked Pattie out when we were making the film, and she said no, which was very embarrassing at the time, but it all worked out right in the end. And, yeah, in fact, I asked Pattie to marry me while we were making Hard Day's Night. And so,
no,
I surprised.
Oh, I thought he was joking. I thought, oh, poor boy, yeah. He doesn't really mean it. I'll pretend he hasn't said it.
And it's taken you this long to convince her?
No, not really. I just sort of wanted to stake my claim on her.
Look into my eyes like a window. Wherever it takes me, I will know. In spite of all the days.
We all love Pattie Boyd. She was fantastic. It is no wonder that Eric Clapton wrote that incredible song for her. When Eric wrote that lovely song, Wonderful Tonight, dedicated to her, you just knew that there was going to be no animosity between George and Eric. And I think it was at a period when George and Patty had drifted apart. So whilst everybody wants to make up stories about George was angry, he wasn't angry. He understood because he was already on the path. He knew that he'd moved on spiritually from that relationship. And in a way, it was beautiful. And that's all you can say about it.
This is one of the sort of famous institute photographs. They used to take the upper school and lower school because there's over 1,000 guys in the place. They have to split it into 2 photographs anyway. But there's a number of people on here that sort of might well sort of be of interest. As well as it being a lot of academically very successful people left this place, there's been quite a number went on for fame. That one there is George Harrison. Then you've got along here Peter Sissons. One unravels this huge photograph. You come along here to Paul McCartney, and then Paul McCartney's brother, who was Mike McGear. And I think they're all the people who've been on TV or in groups. There are a whole variety of other people who've made it very successfully in a whole variety of other ways off that photograph.
Well, George was a very spiritual person, and I think he was brought up in the first instance as a Catholic. I'm not sure about that. I think he was. But certainly he took to Indian religion and assimilated it and became a great devotee and a great believer. He really firmly believed that the soul was the most important thing of all. And he often said, you know, what are we here for? We've got to find out. We've got to find ourselves.
Far from the noise and pace of city life, in the cool, clear air of Rishikesh, North India, Pathé News reports from the meditation retreat of Maharishi Mahesh Yogi, the man who, through transcendental meditation, is currently bringing peace of mind to the Beatles. Flower-loving Yogi told reporters that his brand of peace of mind could only be truly appreciated by intelligent men of the world with rewarding activities and high incomes. Among his most valued disciples were the Beatles, top of the pop pupils. He did his best to keep them away from outsiders, but George had a way for us. Keeping company with himself, it could be part of the treatment, John stalked along the shady paths. Ringo enjoyed the peace of togetherness with Mrs. Ringo. It was a very peaceful scene. So different from those not-so-far-off times when just a glimpse of the Beatles was enough to ruin the meditation chances of anyone within earshot.
You know that I love you. You say you love me too. You give me all those things that make me glad when I am blue. If you listen to my heart, you will hear, but you won't see. There's so much love.
Those were the days. Now, 2 by 2, the world-famous quartet strolled quietly in the lovely meditation preserve. Paul and Ringo shed the cares of their successful world. Close behind, George and John, complete with blanket for even more peace. That great screen star Greta Garbo used to crave solitude. In these days, it's even harder to come by. But the Beatles have found it.
If I was given the opportunity to pick out 4 or 5 words to describe George Harrison, the first one that would come to mind would be spiritual. Commitment would be another one. I suppose in a way, if there was a one word to say, a developing guitarist would be another one. And in his own public persona, he was probably quite shy. George Harrison, very early on, took up a spiritual path. Unfortunately for George, he was laughed at and derided by certain sections of the public because they couldn't quite accept that George could be involved with Hare Krishna, the movement, these kids walking up and down high streets, banging a tambourine, singing Krishna, Hare Krishna. But what George discovered which most of us discover in the end, that there's only one God. And that all these so-called avatars or holy men may or may not have existed. And what these other religions, which are called esoteric religions, teach you is that it's more likely than not they didn't exist. So the idea of Moses and Muhammad and Jesus were all based on folk stories to provide the public or the proletariat with a fear-like given situation. So they were kept under control by this thing of fear, that if you don't do good, you'll be in trouble. George found there was an alternative answer to that, and that most of this really wasn't true and it didn't sit well with him spiritually. Therefore, when something like The Life of Brian came on, which people had said was blasphemy and it was against Jesus, it wasn't a problem to him, because it wasn't something he really believed in, because he'd found a different path that he felt very, very comfortable with. And it's something I can really understand what he found.
It's undoubtedly Park Lane's week of the year. All the signs here that the expected arrivals are the Beatles coming to the Dorchester for the Variety Club Show Business Luncheon. If you've got money, you don't expect to have to fight your way into the Dorchester, unless you're so famous that you can't move your army of fans. George and Paul, and of course Ringo and John, were safe at last, with Variety Club's British founder, C.J. Latter, Steptoe and Son. A few days before this event, Mr. Latter had received the CBE. For the moment, the big gathering of entertainment's VIPs concentrated on the lunch. Hope it didn't taste like the Mersey. Opposition leader Harold Wilson wasn't opposing anybody just now, just polishing up his wit for the benefit of everybody later on. Variety Club ties, the status symbol in show business. No difficulty for Ringo, and here with the Beatles was Brian Epstein, their famous manager.
Had you spoken to him since you became interested this weekend?
No. I spoke to him Wednesday evening, the evening before we first saw Maharishi's lecture, and he was in great spirits.
And when did he tell you that he'd like to be initiated?
Well, when we arrived here on Friday, we got a telephone call later that day to say that Brian would follow us up and be here Monday.
Did the Maharishi give you any words of comfort?
Yes, well,
his meditation gives you confidence enough to withstand something like this, even the short amount we've had.
I do believe that his spiritual path took him into a whole new domain of songwriting. His commitment to do and organise in as much detail as he did with the Bangladesh concert wouldn't have come unless he discovered his own spiritual path, or discovered the part of his path he should start on and move forward with it. And it obviously affected his songwriting greatly through the rest of his career.
All these what we call mantras or chants, these are thousands of years old. They have been handed down by person to person, like all our art form, and kept very secretively to the families to recite at different occasions, you know, whether it could be marriage or birth ceremony or any special occasion or for the harvest or whatever. And these are mostly saying for well-being, peace, good health, physical as well as mental as well as spiritual. So I chose this particular mantras and shlokas, as we call them, and they are all pertaining to this mode of leading to peace.
It was just a great excuse to be able to surround myself with these great musicians and the great words that are being said in this Sanskrit. It's such a beautiful record. It's something which, you know, I was proud to be able to contribute a little bit towards. And like with anything in this world, there's so much material, you know, whether it be books, films, records, whatever. And in order to get it across to the public that there is something there that you know, we'd like them to hear. You know, it's the only way of doing it is to come out and go on and do some interviews. But I think it's a worthy thing. It's, you know, it goes beyond the profit motive of the record companies or us as individuals. It's something which I think has a value, and I think a lot of people can benefit by having this kind of music in their lives as a help, as a balance towards, you know, a more peaceful daily life.
Or he's like son to me, same thing.
Sometimes I feel like his dad as well, though. He can be kind of... Well, you see, with my past, with the Beatles and stuff, we were thrust heavily into the music business, whereas Ravi was, you know, doing his performances in the classical context. And so, in some respects, I've been able to try to help him or protect him from a vicious world, you know, in terms of, you know, contracts or different things like that. And in that respect, I feel almost like, you know, I have a kind of guardian type of attitude towards him. But most of the time, I just feel like friends. And, you know, I just feel like kids, really. It's just our bodies that are old. Inside, we're like 6 years old.
I feel, for me personally, My Sweet Lord was the all-time George Harrison song for me. However, at the time, he had some business involvement with Alan Klein, left over from the Beatles days. And while George was being sued for infringement of copyright, I understand that Alan went out and bought the original copyright of the chiffon song of He's So Fine. So Alan really ended up with both controlling and or administering George's version of My Sweet Lord and the chiffon's He's So Fine.
Former Beatle George Harrison has been giving evidence to the High Court in an attempt to prevent the release of an album based on one of the group's early performances. The CD has been produced from a recording made in Hamburg in 1962. The three surviving Beatles and Yoko Ono, the widow of John Lennon, claim it breaches their copyrights.
Once a member of the most famous group in the world, George Harrison now leads a secluded life. And his irritation showed as he arrived to defend the Beatles' name and to try to prevent the sale of the bootleg CD. People had differing ideas of what had happened or what might have happened 30 years ago. The former Beatle gave a fascinating insight into life in Hamburg in those early days. He described it as a lot of teenagers getting drunk and playing rock and roll, and a lot of crazy Germans jumping around. It was a wild thing, he said. He went on, "One of the problems with the Beatles is the phrase well documented. Self-proclaimed experts, he said, tried to tell what they knew and ended up telling more than they knew. The case is expected to last until the end of the week." Chris West, BBC News, at the High Court.
There were two sides to George in his path. One was, if it's spiritual, especially the Krishna movement and all the spin-offs, he was obviously very generous with them. On the other hand, if it was to do with music or even handmade films, he would scrutinise the budget. He would argue with Dennis over costs. Obviously, when you're making movies, they spiral, slightly different to the music business. However, he obviously had a different feeling for the money he gave. He gave the people, the Krishna people, that wonderful house out in Hertfordshire. And that was publicised, and he didn't like that. How much he gave thereafter, I don't know, but I do know he carried on giving, and not just to them, but to other little groups. And he was always giving to groups that didn't come from what we would probably call established religions. He gave it to people that believed in God, not necessarily believed in the people that were meant to carry the word of God.
He was, although being quiet, didn't suffer fools gladly, even at a very early age. And he certainly was very anti-bullying. If he saw anyone being bullied, George used to sort of tend to step in, and there were a sort of bunch of us that seemed to get on well together.
He believed very firmly in goodness and love, and tried always to give that to other people. This was the ironic thing when he was attacked, because it came as a terrible shock to him. He couldn't imagine anyone being evil enough to want to kill him. But it did happen, and he couldn't understand that.
Michael Abram believed he was on a mission from God to kill the former Beatle George Harrison, and he very nearly succeeded. A court has been hearing how Abram unleashed a frenzied attack on the musician and his wife at their luxury home. Abram, who comes from Merseyside, denies attempted murder on the grounds of insanity at the time of the attack. The courtroom in Oxford has been listening to graphic details of the attack from Harrison's wife this afternoon. Our social affairs correspondent Dave Guest was in court as the story unfolded. Dave, the events that night sounded like everyone's worst nightmare, an intruder believing he had a mission to kill.
That's right, Gordon. Can you imagine? You wake up in the middle of the night after hearing breaking glass. You go downstairs and there's a man there screaming, shouting, waving a knife at you. Well, that's just what happened to Olivia and George Harrison. Only it got worse because the man then attacked George Harrison, stabbing him several times, and attacked his wife too. That man was Michael Abram.
So, Michael Abram is that man, you say. I mean, what is his defence for this?
He is basically pleading insanity. He's pleaded not guilty to attempted murder on the grounds of insanity. Opening the prosecution today, Simon Mayo said that Michael Abraham had had a delusional illness which made him think that he was possessed by George Harrison and that he was on a mission from God to go and kill George Harrison, a mission which very nearly succeeded.
And was George Harrison in court today to give evidence himself?
He wasn't. His evidence was given in a written statement which was read to the court, but it lost nothing in that. In fact, the court was silent, apart from the sound of journalists scribbling to get everything down. George Harrison described how he tried to calm Abram down by shouting Hare Krishna at him. That didn't work. The men grappled. The man stabbed Harrison several times. Harrison said he remembered lying on the floor, feeling the knife going into his chest, feeling his mouth filling with blood, and he thought he was going to die.
Well, George Harrison, as you say, wasn't there today in person, but his wife was. What did she tell the court?
She was. She gave the account of how she had tried to defend her husband. She had attacked Abram with a poker and then with a table lamp, but that had simply provoked him into attacking her.
It's tragic anyone should suffer such a mental breakdown and commit such a brutal act. We can never forget that he was full of hatred and violence when he came into our home.
Abram's descent into madness was fueled by his drug habit. On the streets of Liverpool, he became a familiar sight, wandering aimlessly in a world of his own, listening to music. He was often to be found outside the HMV shop, singing at the top of his voice. Abram became obsessed with the Beatles. He was convinced Paul McCartney was a witch.
I said to Michael, they're just words in a song. You know, the Beatles write beautiful words, wonderful music, but they are just songs. Stop reading things into them. But of course, by that time, you know, Michael wouldn't listen.
But the obsession continued, and George Harrison became the focus of Abram's deluded thoughts. He believed Harrison was a sorcerer taking possession of his soul. He thought he had a God-given mission to destroy the former Beatle.
Behind the gates of the Harrisons' home tonight, police forensic teams are still gathering evidence at the scene of the attack. The house sits in 30 acres of garden on a hill overlooking Henley-on-Thames. Police say the intruder broke in through a kitchen window. He was carrying a 7-inch knife and managed to stab George Harrison and his wife Olivia in a 10-minute rampage round their mansion before being overpowered by staff. Harrison was taken by ambulance to the Royal Berkshire Hospital. He had a knife wound an inch deep in his chest, which had deflated his lung, and after treatment he was transferred to another hospital in North London, which specialises in chest wounds. Doctors there said he had a narrow escape.
The chest is full of main blood vessels and arteries, and the lungs are full of main blood vessels as well. So, as I say, it is just by chance that it wasn't more serious.
Later, police in Liverpool broke into a flat in the Huyton area of the city and carried out a detailed search. The flat's occupied by 33-year-old Michael Abram, who has a history of psychiatric problems and, according to his family, has developed an obsession with the Beatles. Thames Valley Police, who are investigating the attack on Harrison, say they're still unsure about the motive.
Who knows? It could be a number of things. It could be an obsessive fan, could be somebody who simply didn't like him. I don't know.
Detectives questioned the man they're holding for a short time this evening and will resume again tomorrow morning. Meanwhile, George Harrison is expected to spend another 48 hours in hospital, but doctors haven't ruled out the possibility that he may yet return home for the Millennium celebrations he's been planning. Harry Smith, ITN, Henley-on-Thames.
Used to be a thing called Smoker's Corner. which was at the bottom of the, you used to have this 2-2 miniature range, and it was the only place that you could actually go round and sort of smoke without the, and give you fair warning of any masters or sort of prefects coming across. And George was very much a habitué of the sort of smoker's corner. I think he started off on Woodbines, and then we got exotic onto things like Passing Clouds and sort of Capstan Full Strength and things. It was sad in a way because, all right, advertising was there and sort of smoking was cool. No one told us it was going to harm your health, and obviously it had a long-term effect upon him. But there's a guy called Ian Taylor who's in the Old Boys, was also dovetail with George, was quite a great friend of his too. And he said if they're always going on at the Institute about putting some form of memorial plaque up there, but as he didn't actually like the school itself, they reckon that Smoker's Corner would be the best place to put it, and that he'd have a sort of wry grin at that particular one. But certainly George, it wasn't just a place where you went and smoked, but there was more talk and ideas, and people's experiences were shared in that smoky corner than in many other places in the school. We looked at, had a good look out for masters and prefects coming across the yard, and you had about a sort of 75 yards of thing there, until one day they got cute. I think it was a guy, it was a master called Frank Boot, who was well known because he'd quite a few times put a plimsoll across George's backside when he misbehaved, and George actually presented one of his plimsolls to him when he left the school, because he said to Frank, you've had more use out of this than I have. But Frank was quite cute, and he'd been in the military during the war, and he decided that instead of coming across the yard, they'd come up the outside of the school railings opposite the cathedral. And the first thing we knew was actually when Frank Poot was staring through the railings at us, and we were about 10 feet away, all puffing away and trying to get rid of these fags like mad. But Frank couldn't get in, so we all legged it, and we actually did get away with it. Yeah.
Well, I never had the privilege of meeting George Harrison, but for the generation of Bertie and myself, we grew up with the Beatles. You know, their music and the band, the personalities of the band were the background to our lives. And I think people will be very sad at his death. And I think it's worth pointing out that he wasn't just a great musician and artist, but he did an immense amount for charity as well. And so he will be very, very sadly missed by people right around the world.
I'm very sad, devastated. We've known he's been ill for a long time, and just very sad to hear that he's passed on. I've spoken to Olivia, and she's been very strong. And I'd like to ask people maybe to be very kind to her and Danny at this time, George's son. He's a lovely man. I love him dearly. I grew up with him, and I like to remember all the great times we had together in Liverpool and with the Beatles, and ever since, really. I'm very sad for him and his family and for all of us. He's a fantastic guy, lovely man, great sense of humour. I was lucky enough to see him a couple of weeks ago, and he was still laughing and joking. Very brave man. And I'm just privileged to have known him, and I love him like he's my brother. It was a very sad day for me and for a lot of other people, but I think he would have wanted us, to get on and be loving and remember him as the great man he was.
So George, this must be a very sad day for you, but how would you like to pay tribute to George Harrison?
It's been an awful shock today, because, I mean, we've known it's been coming for a long while, but it still doesn't prepare you for the day when it actually happens. George is a wonderful man and a fine musician, but most importantly, I think he was a very loving person, full of humour, and I don't think he really wanted to be a famous person. I think he wanted to do his own stuff by himself. And fortunately, he had, in Olivia and Danny, he had a wonderful family, and my thoughts are with them right now, because they've looked after him. Olivia saved his life when he was attacked in Henley, there's no doubt about that. And since he contracted cancer, she's borne wonderfully and borne him up and given him courage through his time. And so has Danny. Danny's been a wonderful son. So they're great people, and my heart goes out to them.
We pray for his soul to Lord Krishna, that he should give all the blessings for departed soul, and also pray to give strength to his aggrieved family, his wife and his son and other family members and friends.
In his honor and for his spiritual upliftment, we are doing prayers to Lord Sri Krishna so that Krishna can give him his transcendental, loving devotional service.
George Harrison leaving this planet is a great loss to the music world, but also for devotees, and especially for me, because I was very inspired by his music, and he was also responsible for me to come to spiritual life through his wonderful spiritual music, especially the album that he made, which is the Radha Krishna Temple, which has very beautiful compositions of devotional songs.
George, I think his music will live on forever, and his personality. He's a very strong, loving man, but he didn't suffer fools gladly, as anyone who knew him will know. And he's a great man. I think he'll be remembered as a great man in his own right.
If George was still alive today, he would probably want to have one more great peak musically. Either another band or some record that he would make that would be different to everything else he's done before, or even making a movie that causes everybody to stand on and say, wow, George Harrison made that. Unfortunately for George, his path was not what everybody expected it to be. And this is to do with his spiritual path, where he was trying to learn what he was here to learn spiritually. So it showed that his spiritual being wasn't meant to be here for long, because no matter what he did to himself physically and what help he got, his spirit was ready to leave.
It's all down to the individual, you know, what you can manifest within yourself as to the value of anything. Really, the whole of life should be a spiritual experience, because we are spirits who are just encased in bodies. People forget that and think they're just this body, but we're actually spirits in bodies.
Words of love you, whisper soft and true. Darling, I love you.